As I say, people are welcome to leave at any time. But if you do go outside, please wait to come back in until the speaker has finished, just to minimize the disruption. Remember that the session that's being recorded, then there are a wide range of understandings and backgrounds in this room, so please be mindful of other people's sort of understandings and opinions, and keep it as civil as possible. And don't interrupt anybody, please. There's always time at the end to ask questions or for clarifications. Be considerate for people around you. And then there is, for those who use Twitter, there's a Twitter handle which is DiscoverConf.
Okay, fantastic, thank you. So we've been told to start off with just saying a few words from our own perspectives about this particular topic. And if anyone was confused about the room number and the session number, this is session 3, stream 3 rather, on gender and sexuality. So from my point of view, this is a really exciting session to have, because I think that we've been very slow as a research community to wake up to the under-recognition of autism in both women and also in gender-fluid individuals. So I think this is a really important topic that now the research field is really getting behind, and so we're going to see a lot of exciting research happening, and I'm really pleased to be able to come and chair this session and hear from all the experts who are here today.
As I said, I'm on the autism spectrum. I was diagnosed about 6 years ago, so I didn't have a clue. I had heard of Asperger's, but I had no idea what that was. So I was sort of termed often as highly functioning. I'm a lawyer in a city law firm, and I've worked there just like everybody else for a very long time. But I've always been different from other people, so I've always known that there was something going on, just not what it was. But since I had the diagnosis, my sister had a diagnosis now, my daughter, she's 11, has a diagnosis, and we are pretty sure mum, who's almost 80, would get one if she wanted to. So I basically grew up in a family on the autism spectrum, which is really interesting because my husband comes from a different family, from a very sort of neurotypical background, which is very interesting to see sort of the differences. And then also a few years ago, more recent than the autism diagnosis, I started identifying as non-binary. So when I grew up, I knew I was quite different. I didn't quite fit into the gender binary, but there was no internet, and I didn't know anybody who thought the way I did, and nobody understood what I was talking about. So I kind of just went my way and was sort of the typical tomboy. And then when I found out, researching the internet a few years ago, I sort of looked into that a bit more closely, and I've actually just written an article in a legal press about not being non-binary, which is quite a development, because especially in the legal industry, it's not exactly something that people would necessarily come out about. The timing of finding out about both autism and non-binary is quite interesting, because it was in the process of having a child. And again, that's a very sort of gendered issue, because being a mother is probably the most sort of gendered position you can find yourself in. It's really loaded. It comes with a lot of stereotypes and expectations, and again, it didn't quite fit. But it's really tricky, whereas up to that point you can kind of muddle your way through. Suddenly there's a little person. You want the very best for your little person. But at the same time, you don't want to be a sort of, as I say, there are all these expectations from the outside world how you're supposed to behave. And then you think, well, really, that's not necessarily me, and I'm not entirely sure whether it's always the best for my child. That's yeah, that's been quite a tricky process to go through, having sort of then at the same time going through the autism diagnosis, and then a few years later, sort of the non-binary issue. I wouldn't want to miss it. It's exciting. It's really, really interesting to find out more about yourself, about how society works, about communication. There's a huge amount of communication in there, both sort of verbal communication as well as non-verbal communication. But it's also really difficult because there's just no help out there and nobody understands. So this session is brilliant because it just not only raises awareness of it, but to actually sort of see some research going on is amazing. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing. That was wonderful. So I think all of our wonderful speakers are going to introduce themselves. So I get the privilege of saying their illustrious names. And our first speaker is Gill Loomes, and she's going to talk about building identities.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. So yeah, I'm Gill Loomes. I'm a social scientist based in the School of Law at the University of Leeds. I also have a background of working in various autism support capacities. At the moment, I'm working with Leeds Autism AIM, which is a third sector advocacy, information and mentoring service specifically for autistic people who don't have other access to funded support. And we're an autistic-led staff team and doing lots of exciting things around developing autistic peer support strategies. So I think it's fair to say that what I'm talking about today is sort of ideas that I formed through my work background and through my own personal experience that are kind of synthesized through my my kind of my worldview and my kind of what I get from my kind of my background as a social scientist and the kinds of literatures and theories that I can draw on from that. So that's where I'm going. The work that I'm talking about today is actually based on a book chapter that I wrote. In fact, I will very quickly at the end skip ahead to the end of my slides and show you the wonderful book. So there it is. Edited by Frankie, among other people. Lots of chapters about really exciting and interesting themes that will be, I guess, particularly relevant to anyone who's interested in this theme. So plug the book first and then get going. So let me go back. Yeah, so as an introduction, I think a key point to start off with is that what I'm thinking about today represents a kind of a personal shift that I've experienced in my thinking that I think it's fair to say has been represented in the wider world of autism research as well in the last kind of 10 to 15 years or so that I've been in this particular field. Moving from thinking about what we can say about what autism is to thinking about what we can say about what it means to be autistic. And that's quite a significant epistemological shift, because what it does is it enables us to think about a socially situated understanding of autism. So what it means to be autistic, and actually what it means to do being autistic in the world, how we go about the process of doing being autistic in, I guess, a kind of a performative sense. So when I talk about building identities, I'm talking about an action. I'm talking about a process that we're involved in, that's a socially and a politically situated process. And I don't think that it's really possible to divorce the research that is ongoing about what it means to what we know about autism from this socially situated context. So that's where I'm at. I'm looking today at giving sort of socially situated insights into autistic experiences of gender and sexuality, and looking at developing tools that we might choose to support autistic girls and women to develop their own identities and to make individual and collective marks on the world. Just to mention that I'll be sort of specifically referring to autistic women and girls in my talk. Firstly, because that was the theme of the book, and secondly, because this is kind of, I guess, kind of writing the balance of kind of autism discourse, in the sense that I guess we all recognise that, as Frankie mentioned, historically, autism has very much been a male preserve in terms of how we think about and conceptualise autism, in terms of how autism research has been done, historically excluding girls and women from research samples in order not to skew them, to create a homogeneous sample. Well, that does something about creating autism, both conceptually and practically. So I guess what I'm trying to do is kind of correct that a little bit. So thinking about identity, which is one of those concepts that has a lot said about it, a lot thought about it. It's the kind of concept that philosophers can spend centuries kind of wrangling over. But for the sort of simple aims for the simple purposes of what I'm getting at today, I'd say that we might define identity as the way in which a person understands and views herself or himself, and is often viewed by others. So it's a personal experience, but it's also a social and a relational, transactional experience. Much as what I said about autism, it's socially situated and socially formed. And that leads to the idea about how we build our identities as a process. One of the key features that I've kind of observed in terms of how autistic people might engage with this, in terms of people who I've supported, in terms of my own experience, is that we seem to have a sense of consumption around our identities, in the sense that we tend to gain a lot of insight into ourselves through the words of other people, through what we might read in literature, through how we connect with other autistic people on the internet. Quite often we hear people say that they needed a diagnosis in order to understand themselves, because that gave them a gateway into a kind of a world of a community that described themselves and their own experiences in the way that the person hadn't experienced in the neurotypical world. So we can think about identity in terms of kind of an exercise in consumption. We might there's a term that I recently discovered called outrospection. So it's often said, and we might recognise as autistic people that we might experience problems in introspection, so understanding and interpreting the cues from our own sort of bodies and our own mental and cognitive processes. Outroception kind of refers to the ways in which we understand ourselves through relating to other people, and through learning about other people. And I think one of the things that autistic people often grow up lacking, and I'll touch on this shortly, is that sense of being able to understand other people who may experience the world in ways in which we do. There's a whole world of literature that we can see that is from autistic standpoints describing experiences of sexuality and gender, and that kind of body of literature is increasing. It's something that there seems to be a real hunger for. One of the kind of caveats to that is that as kind of consumers of these discourses, there's a potential vulnerability in terms of what we have access to defines how we understand ourselves, and there's a real potential for stigmatization and for low self-esteem and negative kind of self-perception to develop there. I remember one of the first one of my first sort of similar experiences of this was that I was asked to review a book that was about an autistic guide to dating, and I was kind of young at the time and kind of very sensitive to the ideas of kind of relationships, the importance of kind of intimate relationships in my life, and I'd also kind of got this idea from the process of my diagnosis that actually relationships are something that autistic people struggle with. That we have deficits in that area. So being given a guide, a book that was called a guide, kind of emphasized that feeling that I was lacking something here, that this was something that I needed specific support on that the rest of the world didn't. I think if you speak to any neurotypical teenager or young person, they would suggest that maybe that kind of area of their life is at least equally as problematic and as complex. Maybe we need a neurotypical guide to dating to kind of balance that. But certainly that kind of sensitivity to the discourses that we're offered really can have quite an impact on us and our sense of understanding ourselves. So we engage in this process of building identity, as I've said. It's a discursive process, so drawing on discourses, which are kind of threads of written and spoken kind of discussion and debate, the ideas that we're hearing. Even today around this conference, we're kind of surrounded by different discourses of autism that we're drawing on to kind of increase our own understanding. And these discourses exist in a kind of a hierarchy of power, so different discourses, different ideas carry different kind of social weight. For example, we might think that an academic discourse may be something that's reported from maybe a randomized controlled trial might carry significant weight, whereas we might say that historically at least the views and the experiences, the lived experiences of autistic people maybe carry a different weight in that kind of discursive fight for power. That's of course drawing very significantly on Foucault and his ideas around discourse. So what discourses do autistic women and girls have to draw on in building their own identities? Well, sort of the discourses that we hear around being women and being girls, some sex-related discourses, gender-related discourses that we can see here, very much an idea of kind of power imbalance, and the kind of need to resist the kind of the position that girls and women find themselves in often in society, the idea of kind of gender pay gaps, and the rights and the opportunities that we might have in comparison to people of other genders. So these are some of the messages that we might be kind of exposed to from very early on in life. Maybe that we're compared, that we construct our identities, or we're encouraged to construct our identities in comparison with men, which can be problematic. Autistic identities that we might be exposed to, the idea of an autistic brain compared with a normal brain or a healthy brain, the idea of autism being found in autistic mice rather than autistic people. The idea that in some way we need to be superheroes, the kind of brilliance narrative that we have to suggest that we are brilliant in some areas in order to offset our perceived deficits in other areas. And the kind of idea of being different, and the jigsaw idea that we may be that we're a puzzle and that we don't quite fit together, don't quite fit in properly. There's lots there that can be a challenge when we're trying to build our identities as autistic people. And this comes out in research that's been done. So Nancy Bagatelle in 2007, quite a while ago now, did a really brilliant case study of a young autistic man looking at how he constructed his identity around autism. It's a great paper, I'd recommend reading it. And the man that she was working with said, I'm in so much pain because I know I'm going to be alone forever. What kind of life is that? I read a study, like 70% of people with autism expressed interest in sex and stuff, but only 10 or 15% are expected to have like any kind of relationship, and an even smaller number are expected to like get married and stuff. So you see there, he's drawing on a kind of authoritative discourse based in academic research around what he can expect throughout his life course, and it's having a negative impact not only on his future, his perceived future, but on his current position, his current view of himself. And just a quick mention about how we go about building our identities and why this might be a challenge for us. I mentioned at the start that many people find that access to diagnosis and the resulting access to autistic community and literature can be a relief and can provide answers to questions that they might have about themselves. This is something that I wrote a little while ago, trying to express what it means to be autistic because autism is a developmental experience. It's something that we experience from our very earliest kind of awareness. All of our experiences are infused with what it means to be autistic. All of our most basic fundamental sensory perceptions and connections with the world around us are autistic. And as such, they're not generally reinforced by a neurotypical majority world. So what I wrote was that from our very earliest attempts at communication, we're often told that our sensory and emotional expressions are wrong. We're told that cuddles are supposed to be pleasant, even if to us they're painful. We're told that busy, loud environments that hurt every part of our bodies and make us either run, curl up, or lash out are fun. We're told that it's important to look at people's eyes when we talk to them, even if to us this is painful. We're told that the ways in which we do conversation are wrong. We're told that the ways in which we do friendships are wrong. We're told that our passions and enthusiasms are wrong. We're told that we are wrong. So this is a kind of starting point of being on a back foot, if you like. And this is, I'd suggest, one of the reasons why so many of us find that connections with autistic community and the experiences of other autistics can be so powerful. I'm not going to go over this in any detail because I'm aware that time's short. But this was an idea that I explore in my book chapter about what it means to juggle identities when we find that being autistic and our kind of needs and preferences and the kinds of support that we require around being autistic can be kind of in tension with some of our other identities. So this was I was thinking about the idea of how I got around finally to coming out as lesbian and what that meant, and how my autism kind of, and my perceptions about what autism meant in terms of my abilities to have relationships, how that kind of intersected with the development of my sexuality, and how it was actually kind of problematic in a way, in the sense that I had a feeling that I needed support in terms of my autism, but in order to access that support I needed to describe myself, to position myself in a certain way as having experienced problems in relationships, but that if I were to come out to relevant kind of support services as being somebody who has a non-normative sexual identity, if you like, that might be seen as kind of trivializing or belittling or sort of dismissing my autistic identity and my autistic needs. So there was certainly a tension there. Thinking very briefly to finish off about what might help, I've described some of the problems and the challenges, but what might help? And I'm viewing this from a perspective of how we might work together as individuals with individuals. So if you're supporting a young person, a young autistic person, how you might help them. Firstly, of course, it's important to listen and to start from where the person is. Going back to the slide where I talked about how often our identities and our experiences are dismissed. you say that somebody touching you hurts, and you're told it doesn't hurt, don't be silly, that doesn't hurt, you know, don't be sensitive, sort of pull yourself together kind of thing. If you're going to help a person to validate and to understand their own identity, you need to start from where they are, from their own experiences of the world, and work from there. Consider the social context in which the discussion's happening and the power hierarchies that are operating in those spaces. So how is the person performing their identity? What is at stake for them? So think about how we need to do being autistic, for example, in PIP assessments, in access to work assessments, in all the kinds of ways in which we need to construct ourselves as autistic. How do we do that? What do we put across there? What's at stake for us? What might we lose if we don't do it right? And I think we need to start seriously looking at autism and constructing our autistic identity as a kind of a rhetorical exercise, and think about what that brings us in terms of the bits that are important and maybe the bits that get left behind. And then think about the building blocks that we're giving people, particularly young autistic people, to build our identities. There has been such a shift in recent years in terms of being aware that young people need positive ideas about autism. But I think we can go a stage further than that. So I mentioned what I described as the brilliance narrative, the idea that we need to sort of emphasize the positives. And that's an important first step, I think. But there's another step that comes after that, which is about it's a human aspect. It's reinforcing the humanity of autistic people, and the fact that actually humanity is diverse. These are some of the ideas that we get at with the concept of neurodiversity, that we are different, that actually being autistic, being different, rather than being an individual deficit, is kind of a reflection of and enables us to unpick the vast kind of variety of the world, rather than trying to kind of fit in with or offset the kind of the norm, questioning the norm, kind of pulling apart the status quo. I think there's lots of work to do there, and I think it's exciting work. Sorry, I just realised I didn't move on slides. Apologies for that. And collectively, I think there's work to do as autistic communities and as allies, researchers, supporters, people who work in the field of autism. I think we need to theorise and to challenge some of the power hierarchies that operate in the spaces where we're doing this identity work, whose voices count, whose voices don't count, and think about how we can kind of rectify some of those balances. We need to make space for autistic women, autistic people, to contribute to discussion and to debate on the issues that are affecting us. So rather than focusing on what I think of as the autism bubble, thinking about that question of what autism is, this is great that we meet in autism spaces where we're focused on autism and we're kind of looking out to the world. That's an important part of identity, that we have our sense of ourselves and how we fit together as a group who have kind of shared experiences of that self. But identity, I think, only really serves us, or only fully serves us, if we think about it as a starting point in terms of our relationship with the world, and in terms of how we might use that sense of self and what that gives us to contribute to shaping the world, to shaping society as a whole. So, for example, I mentioned here issues like reproductive rights, issues like experiences of gender-based violence. We know that there are autistic nuances in terms of how autistic people experience those issues, but what might we have to offer through those experiences to the wider world? How might we kind of share our experiences, which are often, I'd suggest, kind of at the more intense end of experiences in terms of the the way that we experience things and the issues, the challenges that we experience, they might be particularly intense, but they do have commonality with the rest of the world. One of the most frustrating things that I've kind of experienced throughout my own life has been when I've tried to articulate an experience, other people will identify the kind of commonality with their own experience. And they'll do that in a way that it's not intentional, but it kind of belittles my experience and the intensity and the individuality of that experience. It's well meant. It's meant to kind of normalize my experience. And of course there will be commonality, because we're humans and we're social and we share a social world. I think what that kind of commonality should be doing, rather than minimizing the impact of autism, it should be taking autism and autistic experience and what it means to be autistic and incorporating that into the social world and looking at what that autistic experience can do to colour and to impact and to change the whole human social experience. I was going to read a poem, but I'm running out of time and I've forgotten to bring it with me. If you want to read the poem, buy the book.
Okay, so we're running out over time a little bit, but I wouldn't like us to not have time for at least one quick question from the audience. If someone has a quick question. Yes.
Hi. Thank you so much for your interesting talk. It seems to me that as someone on the autism spectrum, but also does not really identify as a cisgender individual, I think that there's a lot of understanding and growth that the autistic community still needs to do in order to accept the diversity within the autistic community. And what do you think is a step that everyone, regardless of whether they're on the autism spectrum or not, can take to normalize the experiences of people on the autism spectrum without, because the whole myth of this whole myth of excellence kind of puts pressure on us to have to work 10 times harder to be as recognized as someone else who doesn't have to deal with our issues. And what do you think is the step that we could take to alleviate some of that pressure?
I'm sorry, and I'm so sorry. It's a great question, which can have to be a brief answer. I'm sorry.
What I find, to speak for myself very quickly.
Yes,
what I do is that I try in all of my blogging, in all of my tweeting, in all of my talks, I tend to just be quite real and quite authentic. If people who follow me on Twitter will know that I tweet about the ugly stuff as well as the good stuff, like today. That isn't just about autism, that goes for being physically disabled, for anything as well. The world tends to only get to see the shiny side of us. And I think that's the way that I choose to challenge those kind of constructions, by being as real as I can, but also recognizing that it's always a presentation of myself. You know, Goffman had a point and all that. It's about how we present ourselves to the world. I think community is important as well. You know, being ourselves collectively gives us a strength, I think.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jill. That was fantastic. So maybe while Katrina comes up and just make sure her presentation is ready to run. That's great. And we'll try and keep it all to time. It's a terrible role. Are you happy?
I'd like to get out of the way and be discreet, I think.
Okay.
I don't want to block Catriona's talk. Am I okay to sort of hover around here?
Okay. So Catriona Steward is going to introduce herself, and she's going to talk about where can we be what we are, peer mentoring in autistic girls.
am if I can get the technology sorted. I will. Yeah, I just need to get that. It's not just. Thank you. I can't get the. This isn't.
Oh, it's on a different chapter.
Can someone help?
The displays are extending, not mirroring.
Yeah.
So my presentation should be on the desktop. There it is.
It's over here now.
That's Gill's.
Oh no, that's Jill.
Is it, sorry, is
No,
it
it's
working off
here.
the clicker?
Oh,
It's
this
here.
one. This one.
Yeah.
Ah, it's okay. Yes.
And I use this, do I?
I believe so.
Why is it not coming up there? I'm really
The displays are
confused.
extending, so it does
Oh,
present a view on the
okay.
screen.
Okay, does that work? Can you
Challenged
try
by technology.
it? Yeah. There you go.
Phew. Right. Hello. Yes, my name's Catriona. I'm founder of SWAN, Scottish Women's Autism Network. It became a charity. I got it charitable status in 2016. And up until very recently, indeed, I chaired it as a charity, but I stood down as chair of the charity at the end of last month for very good reasons, which are basically, I've been employed full-time by Scottish Autism for the last few years as an advisor. I helped them build an online resource for autistic women and girls called Right Click. But come the end of this month, I will no longer be employed by them full-time as an advisor. They are seconding my post to run SWAN full-time for the next 3 years. So on the 1st of July, I'll be, I don't know what I'm calling myself, I don't know what we're calling me, but I'm going to be working full-time for SWAN anyway. So what I want to talk to you about is the Under Our Wing mentoring programme, which is just, at the moment, it's going through its evaluation, write-up really. So this is a project that was funded by the Scottish Government. It's a 1-year pilot. We had a very small amount of money, but we did a lot of things with it. Funded by the Scottish Government in partnership with Scottish Autism, but it was designed, led and delivered by members of SWAN. We also had additional input from Scottish Forestry, which was fantastic. So the purpose behind this pilot was really to evidence the benefits of peer-led mentoring for autistic women and girls. So SWAN, like I say, I founded it in 2012. Now, it was in response to my research study that I did for my PhD, which I completed in 2011. And it was a qualitative study with a thematic qualitative study, phenomenological. And the overriding theme was, where can we be what we are, which really refers to a definition of home as being where we can be what we are. And the girls in my study didn't feel comfortable anywhere. And I have to say, the reason that picture is there, it's an oil painting it's the only oil painting I possess. I bought it on instalments. I saw it in a wee art gallery in Edinburgh, and I looked at it and went, oh my God, that's a portrait of me at around the age of 11. I even had a haircut and even wore a jumper like that. And there's a photograph, there's a school photograph where I looked along the lines that someone posted up on Facebook a few years ago, and there was that face. But the thing I love about it is this little glimmer of mind that is kind of hovering above her head, which was, you know, that kind of mind going, there is something better, there is something better. And so there is. So I've spoken to the artist, by the way, and she's the mother of an autistic, 3 girls, one of whom has a diagnosis of autism. But I kind of knew that when I saw her paintings. I thought, you know about autism. So the key drivers behind my methodology and my methods for my PhD was that I was very, very keen to facilitate the authentic voices of the autistic girls who took part in my study. And the reason for that was because I was very interested in experiences of anxiety. We knew at that point that autistic people experienced very elevated levels of anxiety. We didn't actually really know why. And it seemed to me that one of the reasons we didn't know why was because no one was actually asking autistic people. So I'm really passionate about lived experience narrative. I feel very strongly that the stories we tell about ourselves are really valuable, just as Jill was describing so beautifully. And SWAN has evolved the way it's evolved. It's evolved because of the work of the women that got involved with it. And it's just, in recent times, I've had to think about how do I construct a theoretical model around what it is we actually do because we're getting more and more inquiries from people saying, how do we set up a SWAN in our local area? And I've had a look at this, and I've realised that what we do and what we have done right from the start very much fits with the participatory action research model. So this is what that means: community-based cooperative inquiry. It's used for improving conditions and practices with partnerships between researchers and participants. But to some extent within SWAN, the researchers are the participants. It focuses on social change that challenges inequality, which is what we're trying to do. It's context specific. It's often targeted on the needs of a particular group, which we are. Often seeks to liberate participants to have a greater awareness of their situation in order to take action. So as Gill was describing, that self-awareness that we are building in our shared discourses, our shared lived experiences, it's like any kind of group endeavour, isn't it? What you actually end up with is greater than the sum of the individual parts. We grow and evolve in understanding about others and our place in society and ourselves through talking to each other. So to have a greater awareness of their situation in order to take action, PAR uses a range of different methods, both quantitative, based on the NHS PICO framework, and qualitative. So I'm sort of romping through this as quickly as I can. So the Under Our Wing Peer Mentoring Project was a response to glaring gaps that we've identified in education and pastoral care of young autistic women, gaps that have, again, as Gill said so well, with lifelong impact on individuals as they have to navigate their way into adulthood in a world that doesn't understand or accommodate them, often hampered by poor mental health, a poor sense of identity, and without the necessary tools for positive self-care. And I'll just do a wee plug here. I did a filmed interview for the National Autistic Society in March, which Network Autism have just put up on their website. It went live about a week or two ago, and I talked quite a lot about issues around self-identity in that interview, if you want to look that up. Oh, and I also have a book to plug. I forgot about that. So why peer mentoring? Because it could be a game changer. So it's about moving from informing and advocating the service providers and the decision makers, which we do as well, and which is really important work, to empowering and enabling autistic women and girls, informing and advocating for themselves. We need to know, we know this, that there's been quite a lot of talk recently about the need to evidence peer mentoring and peer support in terms of its impact for mental health and well-being. So this is one of the things we need to do. And so the challenge was to design, deliver and evaluate a route to peer mentoring for autistic girls and women. So the method that we used is the programme itself. Oh, right, okay. So we wanted the design to be absolutely to adhere to the core principles of SWAN and our ethos, build a pathway for participation. We had it, so this was all a lot of work, okay? We had to build this programme, right? We modelled it as a co-production model. This is a pilot, this is new, no one has done this before. So we really encouraged our participants to take ownership of this. This wasn't something we were just giving to them on a plate and saying, this is what you have to do. We were encouraging them to say, okay, I like this bit, I don't like that bit. I mean, the conversations around, because we had formal training and mentoring and networking, and some of the conversations around that from a non-autistic deliverer, we kind of were mentoring each other. I was mentoring her as an autistic person. She was bringing her wealth of experience of working with groups of women worldwide. But there were some very, very interesting conversations around all that. Scottish Forestry gave us input, found fabulous woodland sessions outdoors where the women just did things outdoors, team building, creative. Key outcomes were around identity, confidence, capacity, skills, citizenship. This wasn't about we wanting people to achieve a level of skills in this area or whatever. It really was about personal development for each individual participant. The demographics were very broad range, 15 to 60 years old, range of employment status. Some of the school girls were at school, some of them were out of school, range of sexuality and gender ID. The main caveat was they had to be able to access Glasgow. External evaluation, again, it's got to be quite innovative, it's got to be quite developmental and reflexive. That's the process at the moment. We took feedback at every single stage of the programme. We asked people to take reflective diaries. Yolanda conducted qualitative interviews throughout the whole process. There was an entry interview, there was an exit interview. We used an existing quality of life tool, and Yolanda's also been building a new quality of life model specifically around this project and the autistic participants. It'll be completed July, August, but we have already had reports of people feeling a greater sense of identity, improved self-confidence, learning skills and friendships formed, and I have to say it has been a privilege and an absolute joy to watch this project unfold. We have learned so much. It's just really exciting, and obviously we've also identified some barriers to people accessing something like this, and we've identified some barriers in terms of how people are able to engage with some of what we did. But for those women, I think for everyone who was involved, they've got something out of it, and certainly for the ones that have seen the programme through, it's been marvellous. So this is just a wee illustration. So we had a whole lot of other things. We gave really good value. We got the women a trip to the Glasgow Women's Library, for example, for a specific kind of trip round there. We ran an arts workshop at a place called Projectability, which is an arts place in Glasgow that's catered specifically for people with disabilities. So these were the bags that we made up on the right-hand side of the art project. So we had screen printing. This was our outdoor session away day that was out at Aberfoyle. It's a group of us there having a lovely time. Our day was described by one of our group as magical mentoring. Oh, and we had workshops for the mentees as well. We had a series of workshops at the Apple store that Ronnie, our coordinator, got organised for. So we had a lot of different input into this. So that is it. There's some links. I'm just wondering, is this attached to the internet?
Maybe for the sake of time, Karen, and people can
There you go.
follow the...
There's my book plug. Oh, no, it's not come up.
Okay.
It's come up here.
I think we should...
Anyway, it's a book that I kind of contributed a chapter and some other bits, so you might be interested in reading. Thank you.
Sorry for the tight timing. So again, we have time for a quick question.
I'd love to know how many women and girls are on the current session and how many you think it would help support if you could run again.
How many were in this
Numbers.
cohort?
Yes.
We had 10 pairs altogether. Not everyone saw it through. So I think, I need to get back to you on that. I think we've got about seven pairs, if you like. We've certainly got about 7 or 8 people who I would now say feel quite tooled up in terms of being mentors. And Ronnie, the coordinator, and myself are having an extra session with the woman who was delivering the actual mentoring training so that she can help. I mean, I've done mentoring training before, but we just wanted to make sure that we felt very confident that we can support this cohort that have just come through going forward. And we know one of the mentors has already been asked to take on a mentoring role at her place of work. She works for the NHS. And she would say herself she wouldn't have felt confident about doing something like that when she first came to Swan, whereas now she's kind of, and also feeling confident that she can ask for help from us and say, look, what do you think? And this is, so, yeah, I mean, we just want to keep rolling it out. This is a pilot, there's huge potential. We've already got a lot of interest from, there's a local school, and Scottish Forestry are just saying, please let us do some more with you. So, yeah, lots of potential. Thanks.
I'm sure there are lots more questions, but we have been told to keep to time, and the next speaker only has 5 minutes, so even less than our speakers so far. But I hope that our speakers are around all day so people can catch them to talk one-to-one.
Yeah, so the next speaker is Victoria Milner. On the topic, it would be nice for people to realise that autism can affect girls too, qualitative exploration of the female experience of autism.
Right, I might need your help again as to how to put this back.
Which one is yours?
I just clicked on it, so it might be.
Oh, is that? Yeah, you didn't hear me.
Oh, thank you.
If you just maximise it and then...
Thank you. Okay, hi, I'm Victoria Milner. I'm currently a research assistant at King's College London, although I did my undergraduate here at Reading, so it's really nice to be back. It's very exciting for me. I tend to talk fast anyway, so I probably won't need 5 minutes. But I'm here to talk to you today about some qualitative work that my colleagues and I did, aiming to capture first-hand accounts of the experience and the perspectives of autistic women and girls. So first of all, why did we do this? One of the most striking features of autism, as I'm sure we all know, is the high male-to-female ratio, with the recent study estimating 3:1. And as we've heard earlier in the session, historically females have often been overlooked in the research. So we thought it was really important to qualitatively capture the voices of those women and girls. So what did we do? Well, we spoke to a range of different women. They were aged 11 to 55 11 to 55. And we spoke to 22 people in total. And that was 4 mothers of autistic females, 16 women who had a clinical diagnosis of autism, and also 2 women who self-identified as being autistic. We also used a topic guide in our sessions. So some were interviews, some were group interviews, some were individual, some were on the phone, some were face-to-face. We tried to be as flexible as possible to fit with the preferences of our participants. And we wanted to focus on 3 main topics, which were resilience and coping, diagnostic pathway, and the impact of autism. So what did we find? Well, we found 5 overarching themes in our data and 17 sub-themes. So the first one, I'm going to talk to you all very briefly about each of them, but the first one was fitting in with the norm. And this covered topics such as friendships, living in a world that is not only designed by non-autistic people, but for non-autistic people. The concept of gender, which was both subscribing to gender norms and, I can't remember the other part of that, and also coping strategies. The next theme was potential obstacles, and this covered the struggle of getting a diagnosis. And research has shown that not only is it difficult to get an initial diagnosis for females, despite similar autistic traits to their peers, male peers, but it's also then more difficult to get a diagnosis from that initial assessment. And our findings supported that. And also, once they'd had a diagnosis, the women and girls discussed having a lack of appropriate support, of what they perceived as a lack of appropriate support. The next theme, perspective of others, both the women and girls and the mothers that we spoke to all commented on how it would be nice if family, friends, teachers, health workers were more aware and understanding of female autism. And also the mothers that we spoke to commented on their perspectives and attitudes of having an autistic daughter. The next theme, negative aspects of autism, covered things such as how co-occurring conditions such as anxiety were a major challenge in the lives of the autistic females. And also things such as sensory sensitivities, experiencing meltdowns and shutdowns, and also additional problems such as understanding puberty and relationships, which has been mentioned a bit earlier. The women and girls also felt dependent and vulnerable and often felt different to their peers. And then a final theme, positive aspects of autism, showed how being autistic can be a benefit to lots of people. And once those females had accepted being autistic themselves, they felt a strong sense of justice and wanted to stand up for other people who might not have a voice. So I wanted to add in some quotes as well to bring a bit of life to this data, not just me chatting at you. So for the fitting in with the norm theme, this participant said, "All my life is like I didn't fit in. I had friends and they weren't like proper friends and I'd fall out with them." For potential obstacles theme, in that time slot of whether they're going to say yes or no to a diagnosis, you could be performing so well that they're not going to see. For the perspective of others theme, I think it would be nice for people to realise that autism can affect girls. For the negative aspects theme, this participant said, "I'm a prey in the world of predators." And for the positive aspects of autism theme, it's part of what makes me me. I'm happy it's there and I certainly wouldn't take it away. And I feel that these quotes really capture some of the important topics that came up from our data, things such as improving conflict within friendships, improving diagnostic processes for females, and also then protecting and providing appropriate support for them after they've received a diagnosis. So that's the end. I'd like to add a caveat that we're aware of some of the themes that came up aren't necessarily exclusive to females. We're aware that some non-binary or male autistic individuals might be able to relate to these as well. But we think it's really important that we captured the voices of the females that have often been overlooked. So thank you to everybody on the slide. Thank you all for listening. And if you'd like to find out more, you can scan the QR code and it's been published. Thank you. Or contact me on these if you want.
Well done, Vicky. Staying to time. So, time for a question. See one at the back, yeah?
You might not have an answer to this, but I was just really struck by the comment about someone worrying about during the diagnostic process that there wouldn't be enough time for someone to see how autism affects her. And I was just wondering if you'd spoken to anyone who'd kind of missed out on a diagnosis, or whether you knew of any research about that and how those people might have experienced that and what that was like, I suppose.
Yeah, so some of the people that we spoke to did have quite negative experiences of trying to get a diagnosis. Lots of clinicians just turning them away, quite early stages, and just quite negative experiences. And I do think there's some work going on trying to improve diagnostic tools that we use at the moment to try and be more specific to perhaps nuances that autistic females might experience. I don't think there's anything published yet, but I think there's a lot of work going on to try and improve that.
Well, it's a question to yourself and to Gill, actually. In the theme that's come up is actually the gender bias in the research. And we're here today at a research conference. Are we actually now seeing a shift in the research to address the bias? Are we confident that is taking place, or are we not? I'm assuming you've got strong voices, so that something is shifting.
I think there definitely is a shift. So the project that this is part of is called the Social Relationship Study. And in the third phase of that project, we're trying to understand gender differences. So we're trying to explore more about female autism. So I think I'm in a little bubble, but from my from my perspective, I think there is a shift at the moment. Do you have anything to say?
Yeah, just one sort of thing that I feel quite strongly about the whole area of, in inverted commas, female autism, is that I think it's great that there's so much more attention now on the experiences of autistic women and girls, but I think I'm kind of a little bit hesitant about the idea of a female autism as in like a specific phenotype. I think again that goes down the route of kind of individualizing and decontextualizing autism. I'm kind of interested in the idea of autism as it's experienced and manifested by people who are socialized and who live as women and girls. It's not so catchy as a title, but I think it captures more what we need to be looking at.
Here, here. Probably should go
Yeah.
on.
Yeah. Just curious.
While the next speaker's setting up, maybe, since it takes a little while. Yes,
Sorry, to your earlier question, why can you answer why is it so difficult to get a diagnosis for autism?
There are lots. That's quite a big discussion, which I'm sure I'm probably not best. I don't have the best expertise to answer that, perhaps. But I don't know if you want to say something.
Okay, I can answer that one. So with my own diagnosis, the first psychologist I went to said that I didn't fit the diagnostic criteria, which were the diagnostic criteria for boys. He said, "Oh, you're not walking like a tin soldier." That was one of his quotes, which was pretty useless. And also so I was really informed next time round when I got a diagnosis. And then also with my daughter, she was refused first time round. You really have to be an expert, basically, to tell the specialists what the criteria are. Otherwise, it's really hard for girls to get diagnosis. Because it's, at least for highly functioning girls, they're just falling through the cracks because they're so highly functioning that people don't believe that they actually have a problem.
I wanted to say, so I have a daughter on the spectrum as well, but I do the autism assessment too. And I want to say that actually it's a tool, and the knowledge that the clinician brings to the tool is really essential as well. So you also need to have a practitioner who has seen, who knows a lot about women and girls and autism in a wider.
Yeah. So just one problem, you need to get to that practitioner first. That's the problem. That's the big step. So that was the problem, to get to the practitioner who then actually knew it comes with us. I think we need to
carry on.
Carry on maybe after at the very end.
Who are you going to introduce?
So we've got Eilidh Cage and Holly Burton talking about gender differences, the first impressions of autistic adults.
Thank you very much. So I'm Eilidh and this is Holly. We are from Royal Holloway and we're here to talk to you about some research which is slightly different to what we've heard so far. So we're interested in the perceptions non-autistic people have of autistic men and women. And this research formed part of Holly's MSc research, and she's going to kick us off by telling us a little bit about the background.
Okay, so we'll start off with what are first impressions. Sorry, Eilidh. So first impressions are social judgments which are made within the first few seconds of interaction. So first impressions are thought to be formed really quickly using thin slices of information. But these first impressions are really quite powerful. So if you form a negative first impression of someone, you're kind of less likely to pursue a social relationship with them. So in a series of studies, Noah Sasson and colleagues showed that less favourable first impressions are formed of autistic adults. So within this research, he had videos of autistic adults and non-autistic adults, and these videos were rated by non-autistic observers. So some of the key findings from this were that, indeed, overall the first impressions were less favourable, but specifically autistic individuals were rated as less attractive, less likeable, more submissive and more awkward. It's really important to highlight as well, from Sasson's research that he had a small sample of females. So there were 17 males and 3 females in both of his groups, so he wasn't able to talk about any specific gender differences. However, research has shown that autistic females may present differently to autistic males. So for example, autistic females may be more socially motivated than autistic males, and there may also be some differences in the presentation of core autistic characteristics. There's also a higher prevalence of camouflaging behaviour in autistic females. So camouflaging involves the social learning of how to act in social situations. So this may include mimicking the conversation style, mannerisms, or behaviour of someone who you may perceive as more socially successful than yourself. So from this, we may hypothesise that camouflaging one's autistic behaviour may be reflected in more favourable first impressions of autistic females. But again, research has not yet tested gender differences. So replicating the methodology of Sasson and colleagues that I mentioned earlier, we really wanted to test this with an equal split of gender. So we completed our research with 10 males and 10 females in both non-autistic and autistic group. So what did our research involve? So we split this down into 2 parts. So initially we had the creation of our stimuli, and then we collected data from non-autistic observers. So our stimuli participants, we had 40 adults, so 20 autistic and 20 non-autistic, and these were matched on gender, age, their verbal ability and their full intellectual ability. And again, important to highlight that we had 10 males and 10 females in each group. So what did they do? They participated in a videotaped mock job interview for a dream job, where the response to the question, "Tell me about yourself and why you want this job," was recorded. And this was later cut down to a 10-second clip, and this was also transcribed. So you can see over here, you've got the shot of the face in the video modality, just from the shoulders up with a nice light background. And then you can see at the bottom how that was then transcribed. So in the second part of our study with our observing participants, we recruited 205 non-autistic observers from Royal Holloway. And these either viewed the video clips or they read the transcripts, as you can see on the side. And they evaluated the stimuli on traits such as awkwardness or attractiveness, and also behavioural intention. So I would start a conversation with this person. So they rated the stimuli immediately after reading or viewing video or text. I think the most important thing to note here as well is that all of our non-autistic observers were unaware that this study was about autism. They were unaware that the people they rated had a diagnosis, or half of them had a diagnosis of autism.
Okay, so I'm just going to talk a little bit about our findings, and for reasons of time, I'm just going to talk about the videos. So we find a number of differences in how the different groups were perceived. And I'm just going to highlight some of these on this figure. So along the bottom of this figure, we have the different traits that people were rating, and there were 11 different traits. And then in different colours, different bars, we have the different groups. So first of all, if we're comparing perceptions of autistic females versus non-autistic females, we find that non-autistic females are rated more positively for 10 out of 11 of the traits. So some of the biggest difference there, for example, looking at dark green versus light green, big difference there in ratings of awkwardness and employability. If we're comparing autistic males to non-autistic males, so the dark purple versus the light purple, again, here we see that non-autistic males were rated more positively for 10 out of 11 traits. Again, for big differences in terms of awkwardness there, attractiveness, and employability. If we look at comparing autistic females to autistic males, so dark green versus dark purple, here we see that autistic females were rated significantly more positively for 9 out of 11 traits. So for live near and for attractive. But hopefully what you can see here is the size of the difference, so the height of those bars, the size of the gap between them is quite small, especially if we're comparing autistic to non-autistic people. The size of the difference is much smaller. So that's important to note, that bigger differences are perceived between autistic people and non-autistic people. And then if we just look at comparing non-autistic females to non-autistic males, so light green versus light purple, here we see again non-autistic females are rated more positively for 9 out of 11 traits. So for example, for awkwardness again, attractiveness. So what do these findings mean? Well, they confirm our hypothesis that first impressions would be influenced by the gender of the person being evaluated. So we see there that autistic females are rated more positively than autistic males, and then non-autistic females are generally perceived most positively, more than anyone else. So we also replicate the past findings of Noah Sasson and colleagues, showing that overall, non-autistic people were rated more positively. But what's really interesting there is that within both groups, so both autistic and non-autistic groups, the females were rated more positively. So we wondered if perhaps here there's something about a female protective effect. So purely on the basis of someone presenting as female, they're viewed more positively. We weren't able to actually measure the camouflaging strategies of our stimuli participants, so we do have to be a bit careful about what we speculate around camouflaging here. However, these findings suggest that even if our autistic participants were camouflaging, the non-autistic observers were still able to detect differences in social presentation, somewhat being able to see behind the mask. These findings do have important implications. So, for example, for clinicians, people diagnosing autism. When someone is seeking a diagnosis, clinicians need to be very aware of some of those gender biases that they have. And purely seeing someone as female, they might make very rapid judgments and maybe rule out autism as a possible diagnosis. And we know that that does tend to happen, unfortunately. Employers as well. First impressions are so important, for example, in an interview context. So again, employers need to be aware of the rapid negative judgments that are made of autistic people, because we know, unfortunately, autistic people face a lot of barriers to employment. So we need to consider how these rapid first impressions might be playing a role there too. So thank you for listening. We're both on Twitter, and if you've got questions that we don't address today, please drop me an email. And we've also got this research as a preprint. It's currently under review in a journal, but it's available already, and I've brought some copies as well if you'd like any. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Okay, time for questions.
I've noticed when you were talking about results, 167 observers were females out of 205.
Yeah.
And I took my calculator because I'm really bad with math, but my calculator said that it's 81% of them were females. So how would you argue that your results are not biased?
So we did control for gender within our analyses. So within the results I'm presenting, in our analyses, we control for the gender, so therefore we're taking out any variance that might be explained by a female perceiving a female or a female perceiving a male. So we try and control for it. But we do obviously acknowledge that it would be nice to have a better gender split, but most of our sample was psychology students, and unfortunately they are literally 80% female, so that is an issue, but we try statistically to control for it, but it is a limitation, which, yeah, it'd be nice to do this with other student samples. I think the original Sasson work as well was with a very similar sample of majority female, so it's something we need to work on.
Just to clarify on that, was there any interaction between viewers' gender and the gender of the model?
I don't think there was, no.
One more question?
I'll just clarify, all of the observers, did you say they were all non-autistic?
Yes, all observers were non-autistic, and yeah.
And why did you make the decision for them all to be non-autistic? I'm just wondering, because presumably the results would be different. If you had observers who were autistic, they may not find certain things awkward, for example.
Yeah, exactly. So I think, so primarily in this study we were interested in the perceptions of non-autistic people, but I do believe others have researched autistic people doing first impressions, and I think they've found that autistic people also make some rapid judgments about other autistic people too. I don't know if you
Yeah, I
can...
believe it was another paper from Sasson and colleagues, and they did find that autistic individuals also had these less favourable judgments of autistic individuals, I believe.
People got any questions?
Well, really, just that what you're saying does reflect a lot of the reports that we hear from women being told by GPs or whoever, saying, what would nice girl like you want with a diagnosis? Why do you need a label? You know, you're far too this, you're far too that. I think it is also, so I think it is important what you're saying. I think there are other complex issues involved as well. So, for example, clinicians also don't believe, for example, that autistic women can successfully raise a family or have a relationship or be in employment. So we hear of a lot of women getting knocked back for those kinds of reasons. So, you know, this is in another wider context in terms of what people understand about autism.
But no, absolutely. I think as well it fits well with what Gill was saying at the start, the different discourses that people have to face around being a woman, being autistic. Like, I think the first impression stuff feeds into that, but it is a small part of a huge picture. Yeah, thank you.
So our last speaker is Kate Whitaker, which would like to set up. And if we have any time at the end after Kate's had her own questions, then we'll throw it open to general questions.
Hello, I'm Kate. I'm going to be talking about some research I've done for my doctoral studies at Royal Holloway into autistic adults' experiences of gender, mental health and accessing mental health services. It's going to be a bit of a whistle-stop tour. I've timed it. I think I can fit it all in. So why was I interested in this kind of area? So firstly, proportionately more autistic people identify as transgender than neurotypical people. And the word trans I'm using to describe any gender identity that differs from that, which is typically associated with someone's sex assigned at birth. So, for example, being born, being labelled as female, and then maybe later identifying as male or non-binary, or any other gender identity. And the reason I'm using neurotypical instead of non-autistic is that some other neurodiverse people also have higher rates of gender diversity, so that's why I'm comparing with neurotypical people. So, both trans and autistic people are at high risk of experiencing mental health difficulties, with quite a lot of evidence to suggest that this is mainly due to their treatment in society, experiences of stigma and discrimination. Despite this, trans and autistic people also experience barriers to accessing mental health services and psychological services. So I was interested at the intersection of being autistic and gender diverse and thinking about what experiences people might have of mental health and accessing services at that intersection. Also interested in the idea of multiple minority stress, so that if you experience a minority, if you have a minority identity, you experience, research suggests, more stresses on top of everyday stresses than other people, and that might be because of discrimination, because of internalised discrimination, because of having to hide your identity. So there's competing hypotheses about impact of mental health on people who are trans and autistic, but there's actually very little research. So there's one study by George and Stokes that suggests that
autistic gender diverse people experience more mental health difficulties than autistic people who are cisgender, so their gender matches that assigned at birth. And then there's a study by Strang et al. That suggests in young people, young autistic people, being gender diverse makes no difference to their mental health at all. So I was really interested to see what might happen when I looked at a selection of adults in the UK. So these were the aims of the study, to get a large online sample of autistic adults and to ask them how they relate to their gender identity, and then to really investigate separately the experiences of mental health difficulties in the trans group and the cisgender group, and look at how they might be similar or different, and to do the same for experiences of accessing services. And I used mixed methods, so I did some quantitative analyses and I also did some thematic analyses on my data. I won't read out this slide to you, but these were my participants. Managed to get actually quite a large group of trans autistic people, which was brilliant. Adult sample, also mostly kind of diagnosed in adulthood as well, so I haven't put it on here, but the average age of diagnosis was 30. And you can see quite low well-being across the sample, quite high incidence of experiencing mental health difficulties, and also a help-seeking sample, so a lot of people that had accessed mental health services. So my results. These are just some of the key findings. I couldn't fit everything in, but these are some of the quite interesting bits. Was that the proportion of non-binary and agender people in my sample was significantly higher than in the general trans population in the UK, where it's thought to be about 52%. So in my sample, it was more than 70% of the trans group were non-binary or agender. And the trans group attributed significantly more importance to their gender identity than the cisgender group, while autistic identity was rated as similarly important and highly important across the groups. And this is a little kind of picture of some of the themes that came out of it. Just going to go over here so I can see my notes. So the first one, gender is not on my agenda, really drew from some feelings across the sample. A feeling that gender as a concept was a social construction. Many people felt disconnected from it, that it maybe wasn't particularly relevant for them. Some people feeling it was really restrictive. Many people saying, I feel like a human, I don't feel like I have a gender, being a person is more important to me. And some people did comment that they believed that their concept of gender was different to maybe neurotypical people because they were autistic. I should say that all these themes were drawn from a free type box that I allowed for people just to say what their gender was. So many people did just write a gender label, but a lot of people chose to write a bit more, and that's where I've extracted these themes from. The second theme around kind of exploration and change, again across the sample, so cis and trans participants said that they were still figuring things out, they were still exploring their gender identity as adults. A lot of people said it was quite complex, that they might use different words at different times to explain how they were feeling, and maybe thinking about your presentation, Gill, how like talking to other people and coming across new ways of explaining their identity had been really helpful to them. And also this idea of change over time. People identified that they might have thought quite differently about their gender as a child or a teenager, and in adulthood they'd come to other ways of understanding it. The third theme, relational and social gender. Again, when people were talking about their gender, quite a few people spoke about how they related to other people or how they related to society and how that impacted their feelings about their own gender. So quite a number of people expressed a rejection of stereotypes. A number of people talked about how, especially when they were younger, they struggled to relate to other people of their assigned sex and how that made them feel about the gender options that were available to them. And again, a number of people said that when they presented their gender to the world, they would choose to do that in a way that was just easier to explain. So quite a few people were hiding their true feelings about their gender because in kind of day-to-day interactions, that was a lot easier for them to do. And finally, quite a few people spoke about mind and body with relation to gender. There were some people who took an essentialist view, so kind of sex and gender are the same thing, although not everyone that had that view actually thought it was very helpful. Quite a number of people thought that was a bit of a shame. And there's another group of people who spoke about how actually their body and their mind felt quite different, whether or not they wanted to change their body. They just felt that actually they were quite disconnected, and a lot of people thought that they connected more with the mind part of themselves than the body part of themselves. So with regard to mental health, interestingly between the groups, I found no significant differences in well-being between the trans and cisgender group. and no significant differences in kind of lifetime incidence of mental health difficulties or current mental health difficulties or number of difficulties experienced. And this is different from research in neurotypical populations in which trans people are found to experience significantly worse mental health difficulties than cisgender people. This lovely colourful thing again is the themes that came out of people talking about their mental health when they were just given the space to say anything they wanted to about their experiences of mental health. So the big blue themes are kind of shared themes that came out of the trans group and the cisgender group. And the yellow and red, yellow are kind of themes or sub-themes that came up in the trans group, and red ones are ones that came up in just the cisgender group. So firstly, people from across the sample talked about how elements of being autistic were connected to their mental health difficulties, and that involved things like sensory sensitivities, which people related to anxiety and stress, as well as social anxiety. Trying to meet neurotypical norms was a very big sub-theme, and I've put camouflaging there because it really ties into the research around that. But a lot of people found that the main impact on their mental health was just trying so hard to fit in with what was expected of them in a neurotypical society. And a lot of people also talked about the impact of gaining an autism diagnosis on their mental health, with many people finding that it had a really positive impact for them in terms of being able to explain some experiences that they were trying to explain. Secondly, availability of and interactions with services. I've got a bit more information on this in my subsequent slides, but some key things that came up with regard to thinking about how that impacted people's mental health. People saying that there were no appropriate services, that they'd been misdiagnosed, that treatment by services might have actually made their mental health difficulties worse, and that many people were using unhealthy kind of coping mechanisms in the absence of services. Trauma and mistreatment was another theme that came up in both groups, both interpersonal trauma, which was a big theme in both groups, and then in the cisgender group there were also extra kind of non-interpersonal life events. A lot of people spoke about, for example, changes in disability benefits, which has really impacted their lives. And in the trans group, minority stress and discrimination also came up as a big factor on mental health. In both groups, people also talked about the impact on their kind of everyday life of experiencing these mental health difficulties. And in the cisgender group, there was also a sub-theme about how this impacted people that they had caring responsibilities for, such as partners or families. The trans group also talked a bit about interactions between gender and mental health, especially trying to kind of access services that might conflate the two, or how they were trying to understand those interactions. And then in the cisgender group, there was also a small theme about, with the right support, actually I can cope with my mental health. But that only came up in that group, which again is interesting. With regard to service access, again, I found no significant differences between the groups with regard to seeking help. So the cis and trans groups were both similarly likely to seek help with their mental health, and also equally as likely to receive the help that they were looking for. They were also equally likely to seek help in the future, or not. Although I think this is an interesting number, so only half the sample said they would seek help in the future, and that's out of almost 90% that had sought help. So that's quite a significant drop-off of people that would try and seek help again, which is quite worrying. The only difference I did find is that significantly more participants in the trans group had accessed private therapy than in the cisgender group. I've got my own ideas about why that might be, and you might have as well. So these were the kind of thematic, so the qualitative analyses around services, and a lot of things that may kind of come back from other presentations we've seen today. So a big shared theme was that it's really hard to get support, that there are systemic barriers to accessing support, that there were lots of commissioning gaps that people were falling into, being told, you know, actually you're not eligible for this service, but then you're not eligible for this one either, and there's no space in between for you. The trans group also spoke about some individual barriers to accessing support, and that they actually needed a lot of support from family and friends just to get the support they were entitled to, and that led many of them to opt out and go for private support instead. And then too little too late came up in the cisgender group, which is like, even when you do access the support after a long waiting list, you get 6 sessions. It's not long enough to build a relationship, it's not long enough to address the issues. Where are services that are appropriate for autistic people? There are no services locally. The mainstream services that exist say they are inclusive. However, the therapies are designed for neurotypical people or they're not adapted, that clinicians assume all autistic people are the same, or they have quite stereotypical views of what they expect to see from an autistic person. And in the cisgender group, this quite worrying sub-theme about crisis, what crisis, which was that several people said that they had accessed crisis services, so they were acutely suicidal, and they'd been turned away because their expressions of distress did not meet what the practitioner expected to see from a person in that level of distress. Despite some people actually taking friends with them, for example, to say, no, this is what this looks like. So that was particularly worrying. There was a big shared theme again about misdiagnosis, mistreatment and experiencing harm in services. So misdiagnoses, especially before receiving an autism diagnosis, are very common, sometimes multiple misdiagnoses, sometimes quite serious misdiagnoses like personality disorders or psychosis, which then had led people to receive inappropriate treatment at best and harmful treatment at worst. People have been mistreated in services, kind of misunderstood, undermined. Abuses in yellow, because that came up more in the trans group, that people had actually been abused in services. And that this had an impact for both groups on whether they would seek future support. In the cis group, also people talking about only being offered medication, not therapy, and again, some people linking that to practitioners' attitudes about what would be helpful. Not all doom and gloom. Some people did want to talk about what had worked for them and what had been really helpful. And what really came out of that was that when people were listened to, when practitioners were flexible, when they had time to build a good relationship, that mental health support was really effective. Equally, when people had specialist knowledge of autism, or when people had met practitioners who were autistic themselves, people had found that really helpful. And this general theme of needing more time, needing more holistic support, and people feeling that actually that was mostly only available privately. Again, finally, in the trans group, people talked about interactions with their gender. A lot of people said that they weren't actually out in services, so they were kind of hiding their gender identity in mental health services, either because they thought it wasn't relevant or because they were really worried about it being pathologised or viewed as a part of their autistic diagnosis. And indeed, some people said that if they were out in services, their identity had been misunderstood or pathologised, so there were some reasonable worries there. Although some people said that when they were just treated normally, when their gender was kind of left to them as to whether they wanted to discuss it or not, that was also incredibly helpful. So, at the end of that whistle-stop tour, what did I find? So overall, I found that across my sample, however people identified their gender, there was high gender diversity and also high gender non-conformity, and a particularly high prevalence of people who had non-binary or agender identities. That there were no significant quantitative difference in well-being or service access between my two groups, although there were some qualitative differences, especially thinking about the things that people identified as impacting their mental health or maintaining their worse mental health. That there was a really kind of low overall well-being and a lack of services indicated by everyone across the sample. And that there was a recurring theme of camouflaging related to gender and autistic traits, which also made me think about whether for some people who are trying to kind of camouflage both those things, whether that might be quite an additional burden. Quite a lot of kind of different intersections of identity were also talked about. So, for example, being autistic and female and feeling that that made people invisible, being autistic and trans and feeling that that might lead people's identities to be undermined or not taken seriously, and being autistic and being perceived as having low support needs and how that might impact on people actually getting the support that they need. And these all pose different challenges in the mental health system, and actually you could also have an intersection of all these different ones as well. So there's quite a lot for clinicians to understand when they're meeting people in the mental health system. So basically we need intersectional specialists and long-term holistic support, which people were mainly saying, sadly, is not there at the moment. And finally, I was just interested in thinking about why I didn't see kind of multiple minority stress effects. So why was it that there wasn't any differences in mental health between my cisgender and transgender groups as you would see in neurotypical populations? And I had a few ideas about that, but I'd be interested to hear other people's as well. I thought about the fact that across my sample, a lot of people said that they were hiding their gender identity, or that across the cis and transgender groups,
people were saying that actually they were rejecting social norms to do with gender anyway. So maybe my two groups didn't look very different, or maybe they didn't present as very different in services. Therefore, maybe the kind of experiences of how people treated them might have been quite similar. I also thought that it's possible that the kind of experiences people talked about with regards to being discriminated against based on being autistic might have been so high, and the mental health generally so low, that there might not have been much wiggle room to see differences between the groups, so that might need a bit more investigation. But also I didn't directly measure multiple minority stress, so it'd be kind of interesting to do that and see if anything came up. But I believe I'm out of time, so thank you so much for listening.
Thank you, Kate. Time for a couple of questions.
I'd be very interested to know the fact between your individuals born female and born male, what the incidence of binary and non-cis presentations, because clinically I have a lot of young women, all women, who are non-binary, who are autistic, and much fewer who are male.
Yeah. So I didn't actually ask for people's assigned sex. I asked them what their gender identity was and whether that differed from their sex assigned at birth. So actually for my non-binary group I wouldn't be able to necessarily break that down. But my kind of, in the cisgender group, the breakdown was kind of probably about 70% female. So I guess if we thought that might be mirrored in assigned females in the other group, then maybe there were more, but I couldn't say, sadly. Yeah.
Two things. One, do you think part of it is that gender is performative, and when you're autistic, there's less performance? It's kind of why we've ended up down this kind of biological essentialism where you've got people saying, extreme male brain. Well, no, it's just not the performance of femininity, for example. So do you think that's an issue both with accessing services, i.e. you're not performing distress properly, and also with gender identity, you're not performing gender properly?
I think quite a number of people did talk about gender as performative, and also a number of people talked about their gender presentation as being mainly functional. So a lot of people said, well, actually, these are just the clothes I like, and, sod what anyone else says about them. So I think in terms of gender presentation, I think a lot of people are kind of saying, well, I don't perform my gender in a way that might be viewed as, binary, or how neurotypical society might conceive of being male or being female. So, yeah, I think that probably is quite having a big impact.
The other thing was, I think the reason that, or a potential reason that you might not have seen multiple minority identities. I'm doing something piece of research at the moment, and what I found was that people who had access to the LGBT plus community in the group fared better socially than autistic people who didn't. So it might be that there's a bit of buffering happening, where that community is slightly more protective, just as a resource.
So that my community might have had more access to
kind of
LGBT
because
support.
When you're autistic and LGBT plus, from my data so far, although preliminary, it seems that they do better socially. I mean, for mental health, it is a shit show, to be honest, but in terms of social well-being, there is more social well-being there than in the non-LGBT plus autistic community.
Okay.
Yeah.
I would love to talk to you more about that.
So I can see lots more questions. It is lunchtime, but if people are happy for us to steal 5 minutes from a fairly long lunchtime, we can have a few more questions. People are. If anyone needs to step out, they can. To be fair to all the speakers, since we've had to be quite draconian with timing, can I ask a question to any of the speakers, and that way it'll be fair to all of them, because I think everyone's still here, if you don't mind, Kate. Of course. So there was a question there, yes.
I just wanted to ask if you noticed if sensory sensitivities and sort of logical thinking play a part in this physical presentation of gender. And what I mean by that is women, for example,
not wanting to wear sensory-friendly clothes, wanting their hair shorter because of hairbrushing and things like that, not wanting to wear makeup or perfume or jewellery, or wanting things that are functional with pockets and that kind of thing. So do you think that it has an impact on how we present our gender and how we identify our gender?
Definitely on presentation. So there was an analysis that I haven't presented here because of time, and I didn't actually get to write into my thesis, but I have done it, which was on a question I asked, just how do you think your autistic and gender identities might relate or not relate? And in answering that, quite a few people said that it impacted on presentation, if not identity, and quite a few people said things like, I wear this clothing because it feels better for me. A mixture of practical and sensory reasons. So more men kind of saying, I prefer the kind of feeling of certain fabrics, or like wearing a skirt, for example, which is not seen as acceptable as a male, but it feels better for me. And more kind of assigned women saying, like women's clothes are really impractical, basically, and I prefer this is warm, this is long, it covers me up. So yeah, definitely on presentation, if not identity. Yeah.
Any of the other speakers want to say anything about on that question? We'll finish on the hour because I can see people are getting hungry. There was
didn't actually hear. I'm sorry, I'm having difficulties hearing.
a question about the interplay of, for example, sensory sensitivities with choices. Any question? Yes.
I was just wondering, just for everyone talking about gender, like a lot of obviously currently in the news there's a lot of stuff about sex and relationship education, and that being we're post section 28, but like in reality in schools that's not necessarily happening. But also obviously a lot of autistic people are not in mainstream education and maybe not in school at all. So for instance, personally I didn't receive any PSHE education because I was in hospital, and the PX staff caring for us had very homophobic views, and we were, of teenagers, and that made me and other people I was in hospital very vulnerable we just weren't educated about our vulnerability, or and then also that thing of coming out as adolescents without that sense of identity, and therefore being perceived potentially as having a personality disorder. So just wondering about thinking about sex and gender. Obviously everyone gets in a massive panic about, or maybe if we educate people about it, then everyone will suddenly become trans. But like how all of this research feeds into education, both in mainstream education but also for those children that aren't in school.
How to reach people outside
school.
Yeah. The only thing I would say that we're proactively doing with Swan is that we're in conversation with the sexual health clinic in Glasgow. I can't remember who invited you to talk, but a couple of us went and had a really interesting conversation with the member of staff from the gender clinic, and I've actually asked them, I've offered to them that we run a series of informal conversations, because they were saying they've got quite a lot of young people with them at the moment who are also autistic and are actually quite interested in talking to other autistic adults, whether we're women or not. So we're actually discussing with them at the moment about how we can maybe set up some kind of peer support kind of conversation, series of talks for people to explore all these things. So that's just one thing we're trying to do.
Thank you. And I think Jill had a comment, and then maybe we'll finish. So.
Just
there's one more question.
Just a thought about how we do sex and relationship education for autistic people in particular, because I mentioned in my talk about how we can think about building identity as being sort of a process of engaging with the world around us and the kinds of messages we receive. And one of the things I've noted about a lot of the kind of sex and relationship resources that I've seen, particularly those aimed at autistic people, is that they still kind of have that slant that they'll mention, we're post section 28, like you say, they'll mention sort of LGBT identities and lesbian, gay, bisexual relationships and things, and everything on the continuum, but they're always kind of the kind of additional, they're always the kind of like the sort of extra chapter, or the sort of the unusual sort of exotic kind of bit, you know, in this kind of like sea of this is what it means to be heterosexual. And I think for autistic people this is really important and really potentially damaging, because as I mentioned, I think we can, and as I think we've discussed all morning, particularly autistic women and girls, but I think autistic people across the board can be so conditioned to kind of trying to sort of fit in with the world around us by taking our cues from those around us, that if we're not also taught as part of our education that we live in a world that is basically heterocentric, heteronormative, and has, you know, very binary ideas about gender, and that's kind of how it's set up, then we can't sort of critically assess the messages that we're getting, and we kind of get sucked into this kind of like down this funnel of trying to project what is normal and trying to fit in, which I think, well, certainly from my experience, can lead to us kind of not really getting to grips with our own gender and our own identity. So I think education needs to be socially situated and socially understood.
A question for you, Kate. One of your initial themes was the gender is not on my agenda. I wondered if you thought that might relate to autistic individuals to have a lesser concern or awareness of social conventions, or whether you thought that was explained by other means.
So some people directly said that it was related to a rejection of general societal convention, and kind of that most societal conventions are set by neurotypical people. So some people did directly say that. There were also some people that said, like, this isn't to do with like me not understanding social convention or anything like that. It's, you know, it's more that I can assess it and just think about it differently. So I think some people were definitely saying that is a part of that. But I don't know if that would generalise to everyone. Obviously, everyone's different, but definitely for some people, yeah.
Okay, I think we probably kept can we thank all our speakers? Thank you for staying on and your good questions. Timekeeping. Sorry, about poor timekeeping.
Thank you. I think it's the right way around.